Ever wondered what foods medieval peasants were banned from eating? These restricted foods were reserved for nobility through strict laws and social customs. Many contained nutrients that could have prevented common diseases. Food access determined social status and health outcomes. Today I'm revealing the shocking food restrictions that shaped medieval society. White bread and refined grains. Medieval peasants were legally restricted from consuming white bread, which was considered a luxury reserved for the wealthy and noble classes. White flour required extensive processing and multiple sievings that made it expensive and time-consuming to produce. Peasants were limited to dark, coarse bread made from barley, rye, or mixed grains that contained more fiber and nutrients than refined alternatives. The quality of bread someone ate immediately indicated their social status. Bread, the whiter the bread, the higher the social position. Ironically, the nutritionally superior whole grain breads consumed by peasants provided more vitamins, minerals, and fiber than the refined white bread coveted by the upper classes. This restriction was enforced through guild regulations and pricing structures that made white flour financially inaccessible to common people. Fresh meat and game animals. Strict hunting laws prohibited peasants from accessing fresh meat and game animals, reserving these protein sources exclusively for nobility and landowners. Poaching wild game carried severe penalties, including imprisonment, heavy fines, or even death, making it extremely risky for peasants to obtain fresh meat. Livestock ownership was heavily regulated and taxed, preventing most peasants from raising cattle, pigs, or sheep for personal consumption. When peasants did own animals, they were typically required to sell the meat to fulfill tax obligations rather than consume it themselves. This protein restriction led to widespread malnutrition and weakness among peasant populations who relied primarily on grain-based diets with minimal animal protein. The meat that peasants occasionally accessed was usually preserved through salting or smoking, lacking the nutritional benefits of fresh meat, including essential amino acids, iron, and B vitamins crucial for maintaining strength and health during physically demanding agricultural work. Sugar and honey products. Sugar was an extremely expensive, imported commodity that remained completely inaccessible to peasant populations throughout most of the medieval period. Refined sugar came from distant lands through complex trade routes, making it worth more than its weight in silver and available only to the wealthiest merchants and nobility. Honey access was controlled through beekeeping regulations and property rights, as beehives were typically owned by landowners who controlled their use and distribution. Peasants were prohibited from gathering wild honey without permission, facing legal penalties for unauthorized collection. The lack of concentrated sweeteners meant peasants missed important quick energy sources and had limited options for food preservation through sugaring techniques. Without honey's antimicrobial properties, peasants couldn't effectively preserve certain foods or benefit from its medicinal applications for wound care and respiratory ailments. This restriction forced peasants to rely on fruits when available or limited tree saps for sweetening, significantly reducing their dietary palatability and missing the energy density that sugars could provide for sustaining demanding physical labor throughout long working days. Exotic spices and seasonings. Medieval peasants were effectively barred from accessing exotic spices through prohibitive costs and trade monopolies that kept these valuable seasonings within wealthy circles exclusively. Spices like black pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves were worth their weight in gold, arriving through dangerous trade routes from Asia and the Middle East. These spices contained powerful antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory compounds that could have prevented food spoilage and provided significant health benefits to peasant populations suffering from poor nutrition and unsanitary conditions. Guild systems and merchant monopolies artificially maintained high spice prices while controlling distribution channels that excluded common people from purchasing even small quantities. The medicinal properties of restricted spices included digestive aids, pain relief, and infection-fighting compounds that could have dramatically improved peasant health outcomes. Instead, peasants were limited to locally grown herbs like parsley, thyme, and sage, which provided some benefits but lacked the potent therapeutic compounds found in exotic spices. This restriction not only limited dietary variety and food preservation capabilities but also denied peasants access to natural medicines that could have treated common ailments and improved their overall quality of life during harsh medieval conditions. Fresh fruits and orchard products. Orchard ownership laws and fruit tree regulations severely limited peasant access to fresh fruits, creating widespread vitamin deficiencies that led to serious health consequences throughout medieval communities. Noble landowners controlled most fruit-bearing trees and orchards, prohibiting peasants from harvesting fruits even from trees growing on lands they worked. Fruit theft carried harsh penalties, including fines, imprisonment, or physical punishment, making unauthorized gathering extremely risky for peasant families. The seasonal nature of fruit availability meant peasants had very limited opportunities to obtain vitamin C and other essential nutrients found in fresh produce. Without adequate fruit consumption, peasants frequently suffered from scurvy, dental problems, and weakened immune systems that made them vulnerable to diseases. Apple, pear, cherry, and plum trees were jealously guarded by property owners who viewed fruit as valuable commodities for trade rather than nutrition sources for workers. Peasants were occasionally permitted to gather windfall fruits or damaged produce, but these limited opportunities provided insufficient nutrition for maintaining health throughout long winter months. The lack of fruit preservation knowledge and resources meant peasants couldn't store seasonal fruits effectively, losing even minimal access to essential vitamins during crucial periods, when their bodies needed additional nutrition to survive harsh weather and maintain energy for demanding physical labor. Dairy products and cheese. Cow ownership restrictions and dairy taxation systems prevented most peasants from accessing fresh milk, cheese, and other dairy products that provided essential calcium and high-quality protein necessary for maintaining bone health and muscle development. Cattle were expensive animals requiring significant resources for feeding and care, making ownership financially impossible for peasant families already struggling with subsistence-level existence. Dairy production was often controlled by monastic communities and wealthy landowners who processed milk into valuable cheeses for trade rather than local consumption. Cheese-making required specialized knowledge, equipment, and aging facilities that were beyond peasant capabilities, creating dependency on expensive commercial producers. The guild system restricted dairy processing rights, preventing peasants from developing independent cheese-making operations, even when they occasionally accessed raw milk through temporary animal ownership. Without adequate calcium intake, peasants suffered from bone weakness, dental problems, and stunted growth that affected their physical capabilities throughout life. Children were particularly vulnerable to calcium deficiency, developing rickets and other bone disorders that caused permanent deformities and reduced their future productivity. The protein quality in dairy products provided complete amino acid profiles that peasant grain-based diets lacked, contributing to muscle weakness and poor physical development. Alternative protein sources available to peasants rarely matched the nutritional density and bioavailability of dairy proteins, creating persistent nutritional gaps that affected entire generations of medieval working populations. Wine and fermented beverages. Vineyard ownership laws and wine production restrictions severely limited peasant access to wine and quality fermented beverages, denying them both nutritional benefits and safer alternatives to contaminated water supplies. Wine production required substantial land investment, specialized knowledge, and years of waiting for vine maturation, making it economically impossible for peasants to establish independent operations. Existing vineyards were controlled by nobility, monasteries, and wealthy merchants who viewed wine as a luxury commodity rather than a dietary staple for common consumption. The fermentation process that created alcoholic beverages also provided important health benefits by killing harmful bacteria and preserving nutritional compounds that raw ingredients contained. Medieval water sources were frequently contaminated with diseases, making fermented beverages significantly safer for regular consumption than available water alternatives. Peasants were often limited to weak ales or watered-down beverages that provided minimal nutritional value compared to quality wines that contained antioxidants and beneficial compounds. Wine's moderate alcohol content could have provided caloric energy and helped peasants cope with physically demanding labor and harsh living conditions. Religious institutions sometimes controlled wine production for sacramental purposes, further restricting secular access to quality fermented beverages. The social and cultural aspects of wine consumption were also denied to peasants, limiting their participation in community gatherings and religious ceremonies where wine played important ceremonial roles. This restriction contributed to social isolation while denying access to beverages that could have improved both physical health and psychological well-being during extremely challenging medieval living conditions. Fish and seafood. Fishing rights were tightly controlled by nobility and religious institutions, preventing peasants from accessing fish and seafood that provided essential omega-3 fatty acids, high-quality protein, and important minerals crucial for brain health and physical development. Rivers, lakes, and coastal waters were considered property of landowners who granted fishing privileges only to authorized individuals, typically excluding peasant populations from direct access to aquatic protein sources. Religious fasting rules paradoxically increased demand for fish while simultaneously restricting access, as wealthy classes could afford fish during Lent, while peasants were forced to rely on limited plant-based alternatives during these extended periods. Inland peasant populations were particularly disadvantaged, having no access to marine fish that provided the highest concentrations of beneficial omega-3 fatty acids essential for cardiovascular health and cognitive function. The lack of adequate fish consumption contributed to nutritional deficiencies that affected brain development, memory, and learning capacity among peasant children, perpetuating cycles of limited intellectual development. Coastal communities sometimes had slightly better access to lower-quality fish and shellfish, but even these were often claimed by local nobles or sold to generate required tax payments rather than consumed for family nutrition. Fish preservation techniques like salting and smoking were often beyond peasant capabilities due to resource limitations, meaning that even occasional access to fish didn't provide long-term nutritional benefits. The absence of fish-derived nutrients particularly affected pregnant women and growing children, leading to developmental problems that influenced entire generations. Professional fishing required expensive equipment, boats, and specialized knowledge that peasants couldn't afford, creating permanent barriers to accessing these valuable protein sources throughout their lifetimes. Nuts and seed products. Nut tree ownership and foraging restrictions prevented peasants from accessing nuts and seeds that provided essential fatty acids, protein, and minerals necessary for maintaining energy levels and supporting brain function throughout demanding physical labor. Most nut-bearing trees like walnuts, chestnuts, and hazelnuts were located on noble estates where unauthorized gathering was strictly prohibited, with severe penalties for trespassing or theft. Wild foraging rights were controlled by landowners who viewed nuts as valuable trade commodities rather than nutrition sources for local populations working their lands. The high caloric density of nuts made them particularly valuable for peasants engaged in physically demanding agricultural work, but access restrictions forced them to rely on less efficient energy sources that didn't sustain productivity levels. Nuts contained healthy fats that peasant diets typically lacked, contributing to energy deficiencies and poor physical performance during critical farming seasons when maximum productivity was essential for survival. The protein content in nuts provided complete amino acid profiles that complemented grain-based peasant diets, but without access, peasants experienced protein deficiencies that affected muscle development and recovery from physical labor. Seed collection from wild plants was also regulated, preventing peasants from gathering nutrient-dense seeds that could have provided essential minerals like magnesium, zinc, and selenium important for immune function and overall health. Storage and preservation of nuts required knowledge and resources that peasants often lacked, meaning even occasional access didn't translate to long-term nutritional benefits throughout winter months when food scarcity was most severe. The medicinal properties of certain nuts and seeds, including anti-inflammatory compounds and antioxidants, were denied to peasant populations who suffered from various health conditions that these natural remedies could have alleviated. Legal penalties for unauthorized nut gathering included fines that peasant families couldn't afford, creating additional economic burdens that further impoverished already struggling communities. Imported vegetables and exotic produce. Trade restrictions on foreign vegetables and exotic produce severely limited peasant access to diverse plant foods that could have provided essential micronutrients, antioxidants, and dietary variety necessary for maintaining optimal health and preventing nutrition-related diseases. Imported vegetables from Mediterranean regions or distant lands were luxury items available only through expensive merchant networks that catered exclusively to wealthy customers willing to pay premium prices for exotic produce. Local growing restrictions and seed access limitations prevented peasants from cultivating diverse vegetable varieties even when they had small garden plots, forcing them to rely on limited crops that could be grown with locally available seeds. The lack of dietary diversity meant peasants missed crucial vitamins and minerals found in different vegetable types, contributing to deficiency diseases that affected their physical capabilities and resistance to infections. Seasonal availability challenges meant peasants had extremely limited access to fresh vegetables during winter months when preserved foods dominated their diets, creating periods of severe micronutrient deficiency that weakened immune systems. Preservation methods available to peasants were often inadequate for maintaining nutritional value in vegetables, meaning that even seasonal access didn't provide year-round benefits from diverse plant nutrients. Guild regulations sometimes controlled vegetable trade and distribution, preventing peasants from accessing markets where diverse produce might have been available at more reasonable prices. The monotonous diet resulting from limited vegetable access contributed to nutritional deficiencies that affected cognitive function, energy levels, and overall physical performance essential for surviving demanding medieval living conditions. Exotic vegetables often contained unique compounds with medicinal properties that could have treated common peasant ailments, but access restrictions prevented these natural remedies from reaching populations that needed them most. Social customs and class distinctions further reinforced vegetable restrictions, as consuming diverse, colorful produce became associated with wealth and social status rather than basic nutritional needs. The cumulative effect of limited vegetable access contributed to shorter lifespans and reduced quality of life among peasant populations who were denied access to plant foods that could have significantly improved their health outcomes and physical capabilities throughout their working lives. These medieval food restrictions reveal how social class determined access to essential nutrients and diverse foods that could have prevented widespread malnutrition and disease. Peasant health problems often stemmed from legal and economic barriers rather than lack of available food sources. Understanding these historical dietary restrictions helps us appreciate modern food accessibility, while recognizing how social systems can impact nutrition and health outcomes. Ready to discover more shocking food history that shapes civilizations? Subscribe for weekly historical insights that reveal the truth about past societies.